Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
Sorry,
Jimmy. Hello, Jimmy.
sorry for the late start today. I'm traveling and I had to go find a room. I think we have a relatively short agenda today, and Laura, who added it, is not able to be here. But the discussion was relevant, something I can probably kick off. Continuing a discussion from Slack with a couple questions around the MCS API. And it looked like the two big questions, very valid questions, were why do we not define target port on the service port in service import? And why these things are part of, basically, I'm going to extrapolate to why do we put everything in service import in spec instead of status? And it's probably a good time to revisit these decisions, because I think we had, way back when, we had a lot of discussion around these things. Oh yeah, thanks for linking in the chat to the discussion. Also, new computer using the web client, so forgive me if anything is slow or broken. So I think Laura answered in chat. The reason for not including the target port is because service imports are really about clients, and the client, the thinking was that the client really doesn't need to be aware of the target port because it's probably not relevant. If it's in another cluster, it may not even be reachable. That was the thinking. If anyone has thoughts, concerns, or suggestions around that, I don't think it's too late to have that discussion. It's certainly easier to add fields than take them away. So I'm curious if that makes sense, if that still makes sense, or if this is something maybe we need to revisit.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, Chen probably has a yeah. Go ahead, Chen.
Hi. This is Chen speaking. The question was actually proposed by my teammate Jean, who couldn't be here today. We were using the multi-service multi-cluster service API, KEP 1645, to build our own multi-cluster implementation. And in our specific case, we were leveraging the native Kubernetes the native Kubernetes service API to actually implement the service import. And when we were developing our solution, we find out that we really need this target port field to make things work when importing services to a new cluster, because we were using the derived service to support everything. It is true that the proposal itself doesn't necessarily limit what kind of implementation should be for KEP 1645. So we do understand that if people were, say, using an Envoy proxy rather than the native Kubernetes service API, then the target port field may not be needed. But we do feel that because there are so many different possibilities, and for those who do use the native Kubernetes service API, this field, this target port field, if added as an option one, can really help the solution.
So that makes sense what you're saying. I think the concern with putting it in the service import API is, in my experience at least, anything that gets put in an API, someone's going to rely on it. And so if we put it in the API, then every implementation will basically need to set it. Or we'll get in a situation where API behavior isn't consistent. So am I understanding correctly that your native implementation like creates services to represent the service imports, and so that's why you need the target port? Okay, so like there's nothing stopping your implementation from setting that target port when it creates that imported service. In fact, other implementations do something similar already. And that service implementation can set the target port, because we don't want to prevent you from doing something. But requiring it on the service import maybe overgeneralizes for, as you say, if you're using an Envoy proxy, or even, it would be a valid implementation of the MCS API to have some like load balancer actually be where what the cluster set IP directs to. And there may be no target port concept at all, or it might even be multiple target ports. And so that's where like the API is kind of the minimum set of things that we were hoping would be set on every cluster, not meant to be like constraints for what you can do if you need additional information.
I think this is related to the second question. This is valid. Your concern is valid when it's in the spec. Would it still be the same if it's not in the spec, but it's in the status?
I don't think the distinct. So I'm not sure that the distinction between whether the information's in status or spec is a huge difference. Like if somebody's consuming it, and we say that target port should be set, then I think what we're going to see is that clients start assuming that the target port is set. And if clients are assuming the target port is set, then that means every implementation is going to have to set it to something, and it may not always make sense.
There's a optional, right? Those fields are all optional. Even in the spec, it's optional. If it's in the status, it's optional. Do you think people would still see that has to be set?
If they start seeing it set, so has to be, I guess, like, no, our API spec is very clear. Like, you're right, it's optional. It doesn't have to be set. But I don't think that stops people from assuming that it is set. Like a service port, like we need a port. I guess I'm open to disagreements here. If we think we should support it, I'm not against it. I just wanted to kind of explain the original reasoning here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think again the bigger decision is the spec versus status. What do you think is the general rule between spec and status?
So when I originally proposed the MCS API like 2 years ago or however long now, I was originally thinking status, because I agree with the comments. It feels a lot like a status. But where I was kind of where I think the discussion took us was a couple things. So one, status is usually meant, it's generally used to allow some other contributor to a resource other than the owner to set information on that resource, right? So like the resource owner sets a spec and some controller updates the status. Service imports are a little weird because the controller actually owns the resource. There is like, it would be, if we use the status, then everything in service import would be on the status, and the status would be set by the same resource or by the same thing, the controller that creates the service import.
Yeah.
So that was kind of one thing, and that like maybe it's not hugely necessary.
Yeah,
but
isn't it normally controller set the status of that object?
Normally the controller sets the status of an object that somebody else created. Like the controller doesn't normally both create the object and set the status.
Yeah. So in this
Um,
case, who is creating the service import?
Well, the expectation is that controller, the multi-cluster service implementation, the controller creates the service import and then sets the relevant information on it based on the service exports, which are the resources that the user creates in other clusters.
I see.
But the real, if I'm honest, I think what it really drilled down to was the fact that prior to 124, and I think it's actually still alpha, there was no way to set status with kubectl. And so it made working with service imports and like prototyping implementations just awful. And part of it was that you know, even now in most platforms, you would have to write some custom code to build a service import. There's no way to just create a service import and verify that things are working, because you would need to have something else update the status. Now that kubectl has, I think it's still alpha support for sub resources, that's starting to be improved, but it's going to take a long time before that's fully rolled out.
I see. I think in our implementation, the service import is created by another controller. The service import controller, just like normal controller, reconcile the service import and then update its status. So in our case, it's just normal flow, because we have a second controller that is looking at the service export and then create a service import. In your mind, were you thinking that's the same controller that is both looking at the service export and create service import?
Whether it's the same actual controller or not, I'm not sure that is a distinction that matters so much to the end user. To the end user, it's your implementation is fully owning the service import. Whether it's one controller, two controllers, it's still magic behind the scenes.
Sure.
Like having multiple controllers makes sense. Like on GKE, I can tell you we have something similar. There's multiple logical processes involved, but it's from the user standpoint, the service import is managed by the implementation.
Yes, because I mentioned this because I thought you mentioned to have a controller, right? It's both create and write the status is not common. I'm just saying this is not what our pattern is. Our pattern is normal controller pattern view.
Got it.
Controller just read the spec, create the status, and then have another controller read its status to create different. The chain is the normal chain.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although I think even then, if I look at like other use cases for spec and status, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe this is too much of a generalization, but generally it seems that spec is set by like one group or like a logical owner, and status is set by some other logical owner. So like it would, if you had a controller create a resource, it would be and another controller update the status. Normally, like the API is set up so that those could come from completely different teams or different companies, or one could be a human and one could be and you know, so that's kind of where we were coming from.
That's exactly what our pattern is. It's two different whatever control. One is set a spec, one. So basically the controller is going from the spec, do what the spec needs to do, and then set a status, say what's the result of what I've done.
Right.
Kind of this is the pattern we follow. We have also many controllers. That's
right.
Kind of like that.
And I guess really if you look at the MCS model, the spec is the service export and the original service, and the entire service import is kind of the status. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that means there's I think that's again, it's implementation detail. That means there's a one controller watching the service export service and then produce the service import, including the spec as a status there.
Right.
In our case, that guy only produced the service import spec in our case, and then there's a separate controller reading the spec, creating it. So that the reason we have a status is we have extra step, have an extra controller to read the service, basically service import controller to read the service import, produce the. So we have one extra step. That's why it has this spec and the status difference.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, basically the service export controller and service didn't produce the whole service import, everything. It just produced the spec, which basically is nothing. And then there's another controller too. So if we combine these controllers, that will make sense. If we separate that controller, they kind of have this spec and the status.
Right. But it's all part of your implementation, right? Like
yeah.
You've got a team who owns both ends of this.
The details, maybe Chen can comment whether it's possible to combine these two controllers. Because it's multi-cluster, so controllers sitting in different
right
places.
Yeah, in our case, currently the service import is created in a cluster more like a request to import a service from the whole fleet, the whole cluster side to a specific member cluster, and then there's another controller who fulfills that service import object with the service spec after all those conflict resolution process. That's the general workflow.
Okay, got it. That makes sense. So creating a service import is your way of declaring that you want to import a service.
Yeah.
Okay. That is something we talked about as well. I think and maybe this needs a doc if you want to kind of write up a really short form proposal so we can discuss there. But I think one of the discussions that we had around that was the idea that the existence of the namespace is, for better or worse, might be a easier to reason about way to declare whether or not a service should be imported. Because otherwise what happens is you get, like, we've been kind of building around that concept of namespace sameness, where a namespace with a given name should mean the same thing in all of your clusters. And if the service import existence is what is used to dictate whether a service is imported or not, then that no longer holds. And in some clusters, like namespace foo might have a service of a given name, and in other clusters it wouldn't. And so the hope was to avoid that scenario, so that a namespace always, like, if a namespace exists, it means the same thing in every cluster. If your multi-cluster service in namespace foo shouldn't exist in a cluster, then namespace foo shouldn't exist in that cluster.
In our implementation currently, we are still following the namespace sameness principle word by word. Specifically, when a user want to import a service by creating a service import, it has to be created in that specific namespace. So if I have a service import named store under namespace full, it will always try to import the service at the namespace. Yeah, so it's still following the principle. I guess our concern is more like, because in the proposal in 1645, it's being kind of intentionally ambiguous on the concept of cluster side. It didn't specify like because my understanding is it's actually a common use case for customers, for users to only want to import services on specific clusters, not the whole connected cluster side. And the proposal kind of like bypasses this concern by saying that the cluster side is a user construct that can be manipulated on the user side. It's implementation specific and not. Yeah, so we kind of want to respect that.
Yeah, so you're right. That is something we're missing, and I think that's because it's actually bigger than multi-cluster services. That's more general multi-cluster concept. I think it's probably time that we figure that out too as a SIG. Current thinking has, and some past discussions have kind of been that the way that you should say that certain clusters shouldn't import an services from a certain namespace would be to disallow creation of that namespace in those clusters. So you could use something like gatekeeper to disallow that certain clusters from creating the namespace foo.
Mm.
And then, you know, that's a heavier handed approach to preventing service import, but it's also more general, because what we kind of wanted to avoid is that we have, if we have other multi-cluster concepts that build on that namespace sameness as well, that let's say you don't create service imports in namespace foo, but you still, you know, create some other multi-cluster level resources. Now the sameness falls apart. So, well, not as flexible, it would be a safer place to just say namespace foo shouldn't exist at all.
Also, if I understand correctly, when you say namespace sameness, that also implies that not initially, or I always thought namespace sameness means if two services have same name in the same namespace service, that means the same service. But sounds like you have one step further, saying if you have this namespace in, if I understand correctly, in a cluster in this multi-cluster, then they should all look the same. They should have
No, not necessarily. Like they shouldn't necessarily have all the same resources, but like the service import should be created, because you would expect that you can talk to, if foo exists, if namespace foo exists in your cluster, then you would expect to be able to talk to services in namespace foo
in every cluster.
in every cluster. Now, if you have network policy that prevents it, that's a different story. But you know, when we've had the network policy conversations in this SIG as well, we've also said that network policy shouldn't really be cluster dependent. It should be namespace dependent. So namespace bar can't talk to namespace foo in any cluster, but like some like backend namespace can always talk to namespace foo regardless of what cluster it's in. And if you want to wall off a cluster, foo just shouldn't exist.
Okay, so if I, again, let me rephrase if I can understand. Means, sounds like at least service import and the network policy, if exists, it should be the same for all the same namespaces in that multi-cluster. So for the same namespace pool in a multi-cluster settings, in regards of service import and the network policy, then they should be the same for in every namespace, right? Other things maybe not, but these three, or at least these three for now should be the same.
Right.
Otherwise, they shouldn't exist. The namespace should, if they exist, they should be.
And like service foo does not need to be exported, or a service in namespace foo doesn't need to be exported from every cluster, but it should be imported into every cluster in which foo exists.
Okay, so import, export doesn't need to be the same. Import, network policy, and the service itself needs to be. If they have the same name, they need to.
Exactly.
Right.
Like identity should be the same. Existence, not necessarily, but identity.
I see. So that's the names. So, and so that goes to Chen's question of the case that some of them, okay, I guess it's kind of just some kind of rule make it easier to reason. You either have it or not have it. If you have a partial one, then it kind of becomes convoluted to see what I see.
And then for the two kind of sub questions, the status versus the status and target port, I think adding target port is optional. And just saying some implementations have this, if we need it, is reasonable. I think it would be good to show if we really do need it, or if like, if it's really just an implementation detail of your MCS implementation, then is it necessary in the API? So that's a question. If we need it, we can add it. If we don't really need it though, and we can work around it, then you know, smaller APIs are better in my mind, but you know, we can always add it. In terms of spec and status, I think the big thing is that status is just really clunky for anything where like until 124 and the sub resource on kube control becomes standard. It's just really clunky to work with statuses. That's
Is that because you want to try without a controller that is actually putting the status in? Is that?
Yeah, like you can't just create a resource with a status. And like we wanted it to be so simple that you can write a bash script to, to kubectl create your service imports. And if it's status, we can't do that.
Well, one thing, in your vision, are you thinking the service import should be created manually or should be created by a controller?
It should be created by a controller, but that controller could be a human, I guess is the way that I look at it.
I see. So,
like,
so put it.
It should always be. Or sorry, go ahead.
So, if I understand correctly, it means it just makes that human controller a lot easier to write that, create that service import.
That was the main motivation. And I think the way we look at it is service import is always created by the implementation, and the implementation could be your sysadmin creating service imports. And the other thing is that the entire service import is always managed by the implementation. That can be one controller, multiple controllers, or a sysadmin, a human sysadmin, but it always is generally owned by the same organization. Whereas normally with spec and status, they're owned by different, like some logical entity creates the resource and another logical entity updates the status. The specifics of number of controllers, like it may make sense to have multiple actual processes update the service import, but it's still kind of part of the same MCS implementation.
We don't have any, Chen, do you have any other questions? So how do we move forward with this? So the target port sounds pretty straightforward. We need to see if we can justify that in the optional field in the image. The spec versus status seems status is putting the spec sounds like the strongest reason is just to make human easier to do kubectl for system admins type of system they can easily create.
Yeah, I would say for both. I think if you look into it and you think either change is important, I would just write a doc and share it with the forum, and we can have a conversation, like a short doc. It doesn't need to be huge, but it might be an easier place and more inclusive for the folks who can't make this meeting as well.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Cool. Awesome.
And do you have any other questions, or you have to go, Jeremy?
So if you do not have any time, I would leave, or if you have some time, I wanted to ask few questions. Jeremy, these questions are related to the SIG provisioning, the SIG. I mean, I was hearing your conversation and I got the point of whole conversation that different peoples have different requirements. The MCS API that we implemented have some different implementation. And who knows, like I was reading one multi-tenancy article this week, which has been posted on Kubernetes. It includes the concept of virtual cluster, and maybe one day we would be having multiple Kubernetes cluster, like 2 Kubernetes cluster that would be having 3 virtual clusters, and that might even fall in our domain. So I wanted to understand, like there are a few doubts that I have. Like there are folks from Open Cluster Management and Karmada who are working on the projects that have similar domain, and they're doing things in their own way. And we have our own way of doing things. Basically, I wanted to understand, we are at the center of SIG multi-cluster operations. So I wanted to ask that, do we have any sort of governance model, how they do things and how we can include them in our own how we can include them in our own implementation? Or if we are not including them in our own implementation, we are at least letting people know that there are folks from Karmada or there are folks from Open Cluster Management who have API for this domain, APIs for this domain that can help you in that way, so that they can actually know how Kubernetes can be used, multi-clusters can be operated, because there is, lots of way to orchestrate multi-clusters. Service meshes can be, used, and various different things. And maybe in the future we would be having declarative APIs like the cluster API that we have currently, and we would be able to provision multiple clusters. And let's say we would have a cluster on AWS, a cluster on Azure, a cluster on GKE, and we would be provisioning them at once using a single API. So these
Yeah.
seems to be, I mean, I'm a new guy and I haven't introduced myself to you properly. I'm a student currently. I'm a Google Summer of Code participant, and this week I've been selected for Alibaba Summer of Code with QPL, and I was searching for some SIG where I can make some contribution. So I'm definitely looking forward to code-based contribution. But this SIG, I wasn't able to find lots of documentation related to this idea, and I thought that this should fall in the domain of this SIG. So I thought of putting it up.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. We are missing right now, and unfortunately, I am going to have to drop here early today. We have a big meeting down here that I've traveled in for, so I'm going to have to drop off in a minute here. But I think maybe this is a good topic for the next meeting's agenda if you want to throw it on.
Okay.
I think we're missing a proper statement on like what is a cluster set. We've talked about namespace sameness, but like we haven't really talked about what makes a cluster set, and that would help dictate how other tools, Karmata, the cluster API, should generally think about the clusters they create to make sure that they work together so that this SIG can build on top.
Okay. Yes.
I think
cool.
that's something that we've been missing.
Okay, that makes sense. And maybe we can have more interaction on this topic in next meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, do you want to throw it on the agenda? I'll approve it. Unfortunately,
Yeah, definitely.
I'm gonna have to drop.
Oh, no problem.
Thank you, though. This has been a really good discussion. I'm quite happy to revisit topics if we have more information now, and it sounds like we do. And I also love seeing that people are digging into the APIs. So thanks everyone. Sorry for cutting this week short, but great discussion. We'll see you in a couple weeks and on Slack.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.